The production manager's hands were shaking when he set the ledger on the table. Wait, because what happened in that trailer over the next 6 minutes had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with a decision Gary Cooper had been making his whole life, and the way it leaked through Hollywood would change how people talked about him for decades after he was gone. November 1947, somewhere in the high desert east of Lone Pine, California. The production was called Dust and Honor, a low-budget Western that had been troubled from the first day of shooting. The original director had quit after 2 weeks. The replacement had stretched the schedule trying to salvage what was already in the can. And now, with 4 days left to shoot, the money had finally run out. The production manager's name was Harold Finch, 41 years old, 15 years in the business, a man who had learned to deliver bad news the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis, quickly, clearly, with as little emotion as possible. He'd driven 3 hours from Los Angeles that morning with a briefcase full of paperwork and a knot in his stomach that coffee couldn't untie. The star of the picture was Gary Cooper, 46 years old, 2 decades in front of the camera, a face that had become synonymous with a particular kind of American integrity. He'd taken this job as a favor to an old friend who'd put the financing together. The pay was a fraction of his usual rate, $30,000 plus a $15,000 completion bonus. For Cooper, it was pocket change. For this production, it was everything. Notice what was happening on that set, because the context matters. There were 63 crew members working Dust and Honor: grips, gaffers, wranglers, makeup artists, set dressers, camera operators. Most of them were freelancers living paycheck to paycheck. They'd taken this job because jobs were scarce in the slow season, because the promise of 4 weeks' work meant rent paid and groceries bought and kids who wouldn't ask why Christmas was smaller this year. They didn't know the production was broke. They showed up every morning at 5, did their work, went back to their tents and trailers at night, assumed the checks would clear when the job was done. That's how it was supposed to work. That's how it had always worked. But Harold Finch knew the truth. The investors had pulled out 3 days ago. The completion bond company was refusing to cover the overages. The bank accounts held exactly enough to finish shooting if everyone worked for free, which nobody was going to do, or to pay the crew what they were owed and shut down production immediately, leaving the picture unfinished and unreleasable. There was no third option. Or so Harold thought. Listen to what happened when he walked into Gary Cooper's trailer that afternoon. Cooper was sitting at a small table, going over his pages for the next day's shooting. He'd taken off his gun belt and hat, but was still wearing the dusty costume, blue shirt, leather vest, worn boots that had seen real miles. When Harold knocked, Cooper called him in without looking up. "Give me a minute, Harold. Trying to figure out how to make this dialogue sound like something a human being would actually say." "Mr. Cooper, I'm afraid this can't wait." Something in Harold's voice made Cooper look up. He studied the production manager's face for a long moment, the pallor, the tight jaw, the way Harold's hands gripped the ledger like it might try to escape. "Sit down," Cooper said, "and call me Coop. How many times do I have to tell you?" Harold sat, set the ledger on the table, opened it to a page covered in numbers, most of them circled in red. "The investors pulled out Tuesday. Completion bond won't cover us. We've got enough in the accounts to pay the crew through Friday and shut down, or..." He trailed off. "Or what?" "Or we finish shooting without paying anyone until we can find new financing, which might be never, which means 63 people work this week for nothing and maybe never see a dime." Cooper looked at the numbers. His face didn't change. It never changed much. That was part of what made him so effective on screen. But something shifted behind his eyes. "How short are we?" 15,000, give or take. That covers crew wages through completion and the essential post-production costs to make this thing releasable. Without it, everything everyone's done for the past 3 weeks is worthless. Cooper was quiet for a long moment. Outside, someone was hammering, set construction for tomorrow's scenes, work that might never be used. The desert wind pushed against the trailer walls, making them creak. "My completion bonus," Cooper said. "It's 15,000. Harold blinked. "Sir? My bonus for finishing the picture. It's in my contract. $15,000 payable on the last day of principal photography." "I know, but so don't pay it. To me, pay the crew." Remember this moment, because what Harold Finch saw in Gary Cooper's face would stay with him for the rest of his life. There was no hesitation, no calculation, no moment where Cooper weighed his options or considered what he might be giving up. He simply saw a problem, saw that he had the means to solve it, and solved it, as naturally as breathing. "Mr. Cooper, Coop, I can't ask you to do that." "You didn't ask, I'm telling you." Cooper closed the ledger, slid it back across the table. "Those people out there took this job in good faith. They've got families, bills, lives that depend on getting paid for honest work. That's not negotiable. That's not something that gets sacrificed because some investors got cold feet." "But your contract?" "My contract says I get paid if the picture finishes. The picture's going to finish. I'm just choosing to have my bonus go somewhere useful instead of sitting in my bank account." Harold's throat was tight. In 15 years, he'd never seen anything like this. He'd seen stars demand more money, better trailers, script approval, billing size. He'd seen them throw tantrums over the temperature of their coffee. He'd never seen one voluntarily give up a dime. "There's something else," Harold said. "If we do this, the crew can't know. If word gets out that you personally covered their wages, it changes everything. The union gets involved, there are tax implications. Other actors on other pictures start getting pressured to do the same thing. It becomes a precedent." Cooper nodded slowly. "So we keep it quiet." "The checks come from the production company, same as always. As far as anyone knows, the financing came through at the last minute. Some anonymous investor stepped up." "Fine by me." Cooper stood up, reached for his hat. "I'm not doing this so people will talk about it. I'm doing it because it's right." He put on the hat, adjusted it in the small mirror by the door. When he turned back to Harold, there was something in his eyes that might have been amusement. "Besides," he said, "what am I going to do with another $15,000? Buy a fourth car, a fifth horse? At some point, money's just numbers on paper. But those people out there—" He gestured toward the window, toward the crew members moving between trailers in the fading afternoon light. "They're real. What happens to them if they don't get paid is real. That's what matters." He opened the trailer door, paused on the threshold. "Harold, not a word. To anyone, understood?" "Understood." Cooper stepped out into the desert evening. Harold watched him walk toward the set, stopping to shake hands with a grip, to exchange a few words with one of the wranglers, to laugh at something the script supervisor said. The same man he'd been that morning, no different. No indication that he'd just given away $15,000 to people who would never know where it came from. But wait, because the story doesn't end with that decision. The story ends with how secrets travel in Hollywood, which is to say, they don't stay secrets for long. Harold Finch told one person, his wife, Eleanor, 3 weeks after the production wrapped. He told her because the weight of it was too heavy to carry alone, because he needed someone to understand why he'd come home from that picture changed. He made her promise not to tell anyone. Eleanor told her sister, just the broad strokes, no names, over coffee on a Sunday afternoon. But her sister worked as a secretary at Paramount, and secretaries talked to each other, and by January the story had started to circulate through the studio system in fragments. Some star gave up his salary to pay the crew on a busted Western. Not his salary, his bonus, $15,000, just signed it away. I heard it was Gary Cooper. Someone saw the paperwork. Notice how the story changed as it moved. That's the nature of secrets in Hollywood. They don't stay intact. They get embellished, adjusted, fitted to the needs of whoever's telling them. By February, some versions had Cooper paying the crew out of his own pocket. By March, others claimed he'd mortgaged his house. By spring, the story had grown so large that it barely resembled what had actually happened. But the core remained. Gary Cooper had quietly sacrificed something of his own so that working people could get paid. And he'd done it without wanting credit, without expecting anything in return, without even acknowledging that he'd done anything unusual. That's when the phrase started appearing. Cowboy dignity. People used it to describe the particular quality Cooper brought to his roles, the quiet integrity that made his characters feel real. But after the Dust and Honor story spread, the phrase took on a second meaning. It wasn't just about how Cooper acted on screen. It was about who he was when the cameras weren't rolling. Here's what happened to the people in that story, because endings reveal what beginnings promise. The 63 crew members finished the picture. They got their checks on the last day of shooting, same as always, and most of them never thought twice about it. A job completed, wages earned, on to the next one. That's how it was supposed to work. But some of them heard the rumors later, and some of those started paying closer attention to Gary Cooper, to how he treated the crews on his subsequent pictures, to the way he remembered names and asked about families and never seemed to forget that everyone on a film set was a human being with a life outside the frame. A gaffer named Raymond Price worked with Cooper again in 1952 on a bigger picture with a bigger budget. During a break in shooting, Raymond mentioned that he'd heard a story about a Western 5 years back, about a star who'd covered the crew's wages when the money ran out. Cooper just looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. That slow, quiet smile that had made him famous, and said, "Sounds like something someone made up. People say it was you. People say a lot of things." That was all. Cooper went back to his pages and Raymond went back to his lights, and neither of them mentioned it again. But Raymond told the story at his retirement dinner in 1978, and his granddaughter wrote about it in a film school essay in 1994, and somewhere along the line, it became part of the unofficial record of who Gary Cooper was. Harold Finch kept the secret for 23 years. He didn't tell the full story until 1970, 9 years after Cooper's death, when a biographer came asking questions for a book that would never be published. Even then, Harold was careful. He didn't want to diminish what Cooper had done by making it public. He understood, even after all those years, that the purity of the act lay in its anonymity. He didn't do it to be remembered for it, Harold said. That's what people don't understand. He did it because he couldn't not do it, because the alternative, letting those people go unpaid, letting their families suffer because some investors changed their minds, was simply unacceptable to him. Not morally complicated, not a difficult choice, just unacceptable. The interviewer asked if Harold thought Cooper was unusual in that regard. Unusual? Harold laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. I worked in this business for 40 years. I saw stars worth $10 million argue about per diem rates. I saw executives cancel Christmas bonuses to protect their own packages. I saw the kind of casual cruelty that comes from people who've forgotten what it's like to worry about money. He paused, looked out the window of his small apartment. Gary Cooper never forgot. That's what made him different. He came from money, sure, made more than most people could dream of, but he never let it change the fundamental fact that he understood work, understood what it meant to earn your keep, understood that the grip who spent 12 hours hauling equipment deserved the same basic respect as the star, whose name went above the title. Dust and Honor was released in March 1948. It wasn't a success. Modest box office, mixed reviews, the kind of picture that gets shown on television at 2 in the morning and forgotten by breakfast. Most of the people who worked on it moved on to other jobs, other productions, other chapters in their lives. But something survived from those 4 weeks in the high desert. A story that got told and retold, reshaped and reimagined, passed from generation to generation in the film industry, like a folk tale about what used to be possible. Gary Cooper gave up his bonus to pay the crew. He didn't want anyone to know. He did it because it was right. Look at what that story really means. Stripped of nostalgia and mythology, it means that generosity isn't about the size of the gift. It's about the relationship between what you give and what you have. $15,000 was nothing to Gary Cooper in 1947, a rounding error, an amount he probably spent on horses without thinking twice. But to the families of those 63 crew members, it was everything: rent, food, medicine, the difference between stability and catastrophe. Cooper understood that arithmetic. He understood that his comfort and their survival were not equivalent values, and that any system which pretended they were was a system built on lies. That's what cowboy dignity really meant, when people used the phrase after the story spread. Not the strong, silent type act he perfected on screen, not the drawl or the squint or the slow-building anger of his best performances. It meant understanding that privilege carries responsibility, that success isn't success if it comes at the cost of other people's security, that the measure of a man isn't what he accumulates but what he's willing to give away. In 1960, the year before he died, Gary Cooper gave an interview to a magazine that would never publish it. The reporter asked him what he was most proud of in his career. Cooper thought for a long time. Then he said something the reporter found strange, something that didn't seem to match the question. The people I worked with, the crews, the technicians, the ones who don't get their names on the poster but make everything possible. I hope I treated them right. I hope they knew I saw them. The reporter pressed for something more, an award, a performance, a milestone. Cooper just shook his head. That stuff fades, the statues collect dust, the reviews get forgotten. But the way you treat people, that's what stays, that's what matters after you're gone. He died in May 1961. The obituaries talked about his Academy Awards, his iconic roles, his place in the pantheon of American film. They didn't mention Dust and Honor. They didn't mention the $15,000 or Harold Finch or the 63 crew members who got paid because a star decided they mattered more than his bonus. But the story survived. It's still out there in various forms, passed between people who care about such things. A reminder that Hollywood wasn't always what it became, that there was a time when even the biggest names understood something simple and essential about human dignity. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear it in the way old-timers talk about what the business used to be, in the way certain directors insist on treating their crews with respect, in the way the phrase cowboy dignity still means something to people who remember what it was supposed to mean. Gary Cooper didn't want credit for what he did in that trailer in November 1947. He did it because it was right, and then he moved on, and he probably never thought about it again. But we get to think about it. We get to remember. We get to ask ourselves what we would do in the same situation, what we're willing to give up for people we'll never know, whether our comfort is worth more than someone else's survival. That's the real inheritance of the story. Not nostalgia, not mythology, a question that doesn't stop being relevant just because the man who inspired it is gone. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. This is a dramatized story inspired by real people and events. Specific dialogue, scenes, and side characters are creative reconstruction for storytelling purposes.